Hello, this is Dr Helen and Welcome to our GenderGP podcast, where we will be discussing some of the issues affecting the trans and non-binary community in the world today, together with my co-host, Marianne Oakes, a trans woman herself and our head of therapies.
So, hi everybody. I'm very happy to be here with Marianne on today's edition of our podcast. We're with Sara Phillips, and as usual, I'm going to pass over to Sara to let her introduce herself and tell us all about the work that she does and her ambitions for today, tomorrow, and for the future. So, Sara, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. So, as you said, I'm Sara Phillips. I'm the chair of Transgender Equality Network Ireland. I've been in that position now for the past 7 years. I have been out as an activist in trans rights for the past 26 years here in Ireland. I suppose most recently, I've been working quite a lot on gender recognition. I was one of the lead negotiators for our very progressive gender recognition legislation in 2015. And subsequently, I was on the government review group of that act in 2018, which provided some very progressive recommendations which have yet to be legislated for. I suppose as chair of our national organisation, I work across all areas of trans life, whether it's healthcare, whether it's gender recognition, whether it's support. And, you know, there's still a huge amount of work to be done over here in Ireland. I'm currently also a member of the steering committee of the International Trans Fund, which is a philanthropy organisation providing funding to small trans organisations, specifically in the global south, but also in Asia, who work to try and support trans communities in difficult areas.
Oh, wow. Well, that is one introduction. I'm so excited to quiz you on some of this. So just going back to the beginning, you say you've been an activist for 26 years. So how have things progressed, changed, developed, reverted in that 26 years?
Well, it's changed quite a lot. I think when I came out first, it was 1992. And I suppose trans people in Ireland were few. In fact, for most of us who were around at that point, we would tended to have looked to the UK quite a lot. We did have some groups starting up at that point. We'd had a long-standing group which started in 1977. We'd come out of the Beaumont Society, ironically, but more for trans people over here and also for trans people who were looking to transition. But they were still very much in the shadows. They still were meeting in private, very much trying to make sure that, they lived in stealth, they met in stealth, etc. While the 90s, Ireland itself in the 90s changed dramatically because, financially we became a different country. We became a much more progressive country. Lots of things changed. The old Celtic tiger roared and we all kind of got on its back and followed. But, it for trans people then started to feel a little bit more comfortable being out because we had a kind of an atmosphere of anything goes over here at that point. And for that, then, when we eventually got into the early 2000s, we started to form groups and we started to come together and the community started to become a little bit more visible. We were still very small in numbers. I think that changed in around 2005. There had been previous things going on around work, a little bit of work by individuals with the Equality Authority and also some legislative work by Dr. Lydia Foy, who was taking a legal case to look for a change on her birth cert of her gender. So an organisation then, our current organisation, Transgender Equality Network, came together in late 2005, early 2006, in order, one, to support that case, but also to provide support groups around the country. So I think that kind of process really, there was very small incremental changes over that long period of time. However, by 2010, we had received some funding and there was a much broader outlook and a much more positive outlook for the community. We started to work in various different areas in looking to try and get appropriate healthcare, look at trying getting, gender recognition, etc. And also then starting to work in places like employment, starting to work on hate crime, etc. And for that matter, then I think things started to improve. People were more willing to be out. People were more willing to identify as trans, more so than just to move into the binary. and in stealth. So it has been a long kind of period, long time coming, but it's really moved very fast, especially in the last 7 years, 6, maybe 8 years, and things have really, really moved. And our community now is much younger, it's much louder, it's much more visible compared to where, those of us who were out in the 90s quietly going about our business.
I mean, that's that kind of pathway that you talk about, that trajectory and increase is certainly what we've seen in healthcare, isn't it? And if you look at the numbers of people coming forward to medical services for help, we've seen the same kind of thing, just slow. People didn't really want to come forward. And then the last, like you say, 7-8 years, really, it's really, really increased. And in the same way that you said, younger, louder and more visible. And that's exactly what we've seen, isn't it? People having the courage to come forward and come out and speak loudly. And of course, that's caused some controversy, hasn't it? Particularly that the younger group. And you mentioned hate crimes as part of the work that you do, and obviously we do see a lot of hate directed at that younger group that you mentioned there. Is that something that you see in Ireland as well?
Not so much to the same degree as you do in the UK. And I'm quite aware of a lot of what happens over there because I also kind of do a lot of work over there and I've got a lot of friends. And we don't have, while we still try to impress upon authorities the problem with hate crime and the issues that occur, in reality, I suppose the percentage of hate crimes that we find on trans people are an awful lot less than they would be, say, in the UK. Even per head of population, they can be quite low. However, that shouldn't take away from that the seriousness of them when they happen, and they do happen. There's no doubt about that. And I think they're starting now in more recent times. We're starting to see a lot more of it, especially now where there's a lot of negativity online. There's obviously campaigns across the UK, which obviously filters in here, across social media like Twitter and Facebook and stuff that comes on in the likes of the Mail and the Sunday Times. And, all of these have an effect over here because while we have our own media, we will always still have that influence coming from the UK. And we will also have that kind of seeping in of those sort of attitudes sometimes. And then you get Irish people sometimes picking them up and then running with them. So we are seeing a little bit more of that now at the moment, especially in the last 2 years, especially since the Gender Recognition Review Group put out their recommendations. There was a much more public kind of submission process. And those who are very negative around that then start to become very public about it. I think some of the things that you have, say, for instance, in social media, especially on Twitter, and you're sure without naming names, we can name some of the people that are very vocal in those areas, especially some Irish people who happen to be living in the UK, that they have an effect over here that then will kind of have people take up those attitudes and will then eventually, seep into a kind of being violent or even being transphobic, just, verbally or whatever. And that we're seeing that a little bit more. And again, because the community is younger and because we're starting to see more and more people who are visible, then the likelihood is that we're going to get more and more of it. And it's something that we're trying hard now to work on and trying hard to guard against.
I just wanted to interject there. I'm not sure, are there young persons services, transgender healthcare services in Ireland?
Yes, and we do have, and this is probably even more my colleague Vanessa Lacey's place to talk about this, but we work very closely with the healthcare system, the HSE, which is our healthcare executive over here, and we've worked with them for the last 8-9 years. We proposed back a number of years ago that they should introduce healthcare services for under 18s. We provided them with some information. We gave them recommendations. They then partnered with Tavistock around providing a service here on a temporary basis, with eventually getting the service here up to speed and then providing a localised service from within Dublin. That service from Tavistock is currently two things. One, it's under pressure because of the same sort of pressure that's going on in the UK. But also, it has also got only one more year to run because by 2021, the healthcare executive are supposed to have had their system in place, their service in place. And currently that is very much a difficult situation at the moment because they're not really ready. Even though there's 11 months to go, they still are not really at a position to do that in January. But also then the system is under pressure because they currently have, I think, 350 young people in the service. And that is just breaking at the seams. Tavistock can't handle that, even with the fact that they're breaking at the seams in the UK at the moment. But the pressure of the controversy and the negativity around Tavistock that's happening in the UK is now again filtering in over here into some of the media.
Feels like it's all very much intertwined then. Both countries are mirroring each other in the political and social climate at the moment, from what you're saying.
I would kind of pull back a little bit from that, Marianne. I think from a political perspective, there's definitely a political will to be very supportive. There's definitely a political will to advance our rights and provide proper services. The outgoing government was very positive to, one, implement the recommendations of the Gender Recognition Review Group, and hopefully to the full scale of that. They will do that eventually, whoever comes in afterwards, because there is quite a lot of cross-party support. From a healthcare perspective, again, politically, at healthcare executive or health service executive level, senior level, we've worked with them, with their senior management, and also at the Department of Health, the Minister for Department of Health, have all been very positive towards implementing appropriate healthcare. The problem is that it's like, trying to turn that ferry in the bay. You don't do it very quickly. You don't do it quickly. The healthcare executive here is actually quite unwieldy. It has a lot of problems generally, and therefore trying to get people to move and shift is difficult. We have introduced earlier this year the National Gender Service, and they have made huge improvements. They have recently brought out, as you may have seen, there have been some difficulties in relation to waiting lists. They are improving those, but we're still skeptical that it's all going to be, brilliant in the future. But we are trying to push and fight and work and at least talk to them about those changes that they're making. But again, there is some political, I suppose, debate and discussion at lower level, at the actual service level, about the appropriate type of service that's being provided. And that's kind of, so while on one level, politically, from a government point of view, but also from a healthcare service point of view, the upper levels are all very much on board in approving, international best standards. It's very much a case that the clinicians and the people running the service are very much the ones you're having the problems with.
In what way?
Well, currently the gender service, the National Gender Service, is supposedly running a model of international best practice based on WPAT guidelines, based upon informed consent. However, in reality, that is not what's actually happening. In fact, they say they're running as a psychosocial model, which is based on looking at all the needs of the person in question. However, what's in reality is you very much have a diagnostic process, which is quite onerous for most people because it's quite intrusive. It's really difficult to navigate, and it's very difficult to have to spend a lot of time, because it's not just a 1 hour assessment. It can be 3 or 4 hours assessment initially. And, it's delving into areas of your life that really probably have no, relevance to your healthcare in this area.
I think people who haven't been through that system, I haven't been through that system, but I've heard people tell me about that, going through that system. People who haven't heard the questions, the line of questioning, and Marianne and I often talk about, actually, it's quite traumatic to people to have to go down that line in order to convince a doctor or a therapist to give them a diagnosis of their own identity. And, as a doctor, it makes me shudder. It really does make me shudder. It's like having a gender equality policy for every hospital, every healthcare service, every school. It's all very well having that policy and all the wording in it, but if no one takes a blind bit of notice of it and doesn't follow through on any of its content, what is the point of having that policy? And actually, it makes me quite cross. I'm feeling quite cross at the moment, I have to say. And I just wonder at the kind of countries around us who are copying the UK model of gender healthcare provision, when clearly ours is so broken. And then we're seeing other people copying it. We're seeing, Wales, for example, are kind of creating their own gender identity service, running along the same model that England uses. And we know that it's broken. And time again, we at GenderGP, we're campaigning that we have so many good doctors. Every single town, village has a number of good doctors who could provide this care. And the patient could go to that doctor and say, "Doctor, I've got something to tell you. My gender is different to the one that I was given at birth, and different to the one that everyone else feels it should be. My gender is different to that, and I need to switch my hormones to make my gender fit." And every single town and village has a number of doctors who could easily facilitate that if they just believed that person. But of course, I do wonder if we did that, and this is being put to me more and more recently, is if we did that, what happens to those super specialists? What happens to their jobs? What happens to the super specialist gender services that they've spent so many years creating and nurturing? Because, of course, if this can be done by a GP, we didn't need those people in the first place. And what happens to their jobs? And sometimes, I just wonder politically what is going on there and what the future holds. But as a GP myself, it makes me very cross, because this care can so easily be given by a general practice team. And I promise you one thing, that the general practice team would not ask those invasive questions, which actually are quite traumatic and, as you say, completely irrelevant, intrusive and traumatic. Oh, sorry, I went off on one then.
I think the irony for Ireland is that, when I went through that process, it was much more a psychosocial model. It was very much more based on you not having to prove who you are, but you being believed who you are. And ironically, that is some of the same people that are currently running the system have changed their mind. They've changed the way they do things, because initially when the service started up here 20 years ago, it was a much easier thing to navigate. It was, you got your supports, you went to your psychologist to talk about the usual needs of, the support you need, whether your family were supportive, whether your work was supportive, whether you needed anything else. You talked all that through, but they weren't diagnosing you as trans or as for whatever gender you are. They were believing you that that's what you said you are, who you are, said you are. But they were there to provide that support psychologically, going through what for all of us is a difficult process, but people should be there to support you rather than to actually gatekeep you. And I think that's where the difference is. And it's very difficult for us here to know that that's something that I went through, but yet young people today have to navigate this, what is basically a process that started in the 70s and the 80s. And really, we've moved on. We've learned so much more, globally about trans lives and about these issues. And it's very hard to understand why these individuals haven't moved on too.
Because I got a diagnosis through the NHS, and I remember just asking the doctor, they were asking me loads of questions, and I said, "Why are you asking me these questions?" And she just said, "Oh, because we're going to give you a diagnosis of transsexualism and gender dysphoria." And I actually physically recoiled. And I thought, but I didn't ask for that. I haven't come to you needing a diagnosis. I've come to you because I understand myself and I need support. And I think that is it. I just get the sense that the people that want the creating it and making it more complex to give more credence to their expert status. And I'm hoping Helen agrees with me, but the model of care that we operate is that the patient is the expert. We're just the professionals facilitating responsibly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and that's exactly what the specialist, the specialist should be providing. That's what you should be doing. It's like if you go to the simple example, you go to your doctor and you say, I've got a headache. The doctor believes that you've got a headache. That's the first thing, So, it may sound very simple, but that should be the first premise of what the treatment is based upon. And as you say, you're going to your GP or you're going to your specialist asking for support to do what you need to do, but you shouldn't be gatekept through it. Things shouldn't happen. And I think that's currently what's happening. It's we're regressing currently in healthcare. And yet, ironically, over, here, we are taking some huge strides, publicly, legislatively, in various different ways. And yet in healthcare, we're actually regressing, which is really disappointing for us at the moment. It's been a kind of an eye-opener as to the work we've been doing over the last 10 years specifically, that we've been able to have the ability to persuade politicians that we should have the right to self-determine our gender in a very simple administrative process. And we can make all the human rights cases for that, and we can provide all the evidence base that we need, and that people have come along on that journey and understood it, that actually when you come to healthcare professionals, you can't make that same argument and you still can't do that persuasion because they feel that they know better.
We need an uproar. We just need a massive uproar to get back the rights of people to live the way that they need to. I want to ask you something about I was kind of waiting to pounce on you for using the word self-identification, because I was watching a thread on Twitter the other day, and a trans woman there got quite upset at this concept of self-identity, and I couldn't really unpick what it was all about. And I think what she was really saying is that this is my identity, and I don't even need to self-identify or be given permission to self-identify. I just identify, and you almost insult me by even permitting me to self-identify. Obviously you've done a lot of work on that gender recognition, and I wondered whether you had if you could make that clearer for me to understand.
Yeah, I think for us, when you step back, first of all, to what is the core principle of identification, it's an innate sense of self. It's understanding how you want to identify, how you present, how you believe you are, how everything about you, whatever it is, whether it's you're funny, whether you're loud, whether you're quiet, whatever, all these pieces of your identity are formed in sometimes subconsciously by yourself. It happens. Nobody else tells you, Helen, you need to be loud. That's the sort of person we want you to be. We always find our comfort in ourselves. I believe, and we believe, that gender is a very similar process. It's this understanding that somebody else putting upon us a gender at birth is not something that should happen, and therefore we should have the right to say to the world, this is how we identify as our gender. And I understand that woman's comments about, I shouldn't really need to self-identify. But I suppose from an administrative point of view, there always is going to have to be some sort of process to be able to that. We're never going to have a utopian world where we can just be. And I think for us, a lot of the argument when we were negotiating the Gender Recognition Act in 2015 was around this right to identify as in whatever way we would want to identify. So my argument, Helen, what way do you identify? Who decided that gender? So if you identify as female, who decided that gender? In reality, it wasn't the person who wrote it on your birth cert. In reality, it wasn't your parents. It was you. And the reason why you, Helen, have decided and to identify, say, as female, if that's what you identify as, is because you have accepted what they said. And you feel comfort within that space and you continue to identify that. However, for us, that is untrue. We do not identify with what gender we've been put on our birth certificate, and therefore we should have the right to identify for whatever way we want to.
Can I just put a little twist in there as well? Because I mean, we had a peer support group on Friday talking about language, and we had a little discussion within the team on Monday about language and how it develops. And I think a lot depends on the time and the fight that we were fighting. But for me, self-identification means I don't want somebody else determining my identity. I've got the right to decide myself. And I think trouble that certainly in the UK, a panel would have to discuss my identity who never meet me, based on psychological reports from psychiatrists that just confirm that what I'm feeling is genuine. And that is dehumanizing. That takes away my ability to be myself. And I think for me, self-identity isn't about, it's to stop other people driving me down the wrong road, that I will determine what road to go down, not anybody else. So
totally agree. It's our right to decide, not somebody else's right to decide, which is important. And funnily enough, just as a side note, I met the chair of that panel about a year ago at a Bagus conference. I was giving a keynote speech there. And actually, we had this conversation, and she found it very difficult to understand, even leaving the meeting or the interaction, to understand that this was very dehumanizing for somebody to have to ask their permission to identify in the way we believe we should. And it was a learning process for me that, somebody actually couldn't even get the core principle of that she had the right to identify whatever way she wanted, really, because she agreed with what everybody else said for the people who chose it for her. That was acceptable. Well, if I was to turn around and say, no, that is not acceptable for us, she should have that right. So I don't know. It's very difficult to kind of get to the core of people's understanding of self-identity. And then it causes all the usual knock-on effects of problems, that because people then start throwing it into other problems in other ways, and I don't want to really go down the whole kind of arguments of spaces and stuff like that, because we don't have that issue here. And therefore it's not really a conversation that we have over here as a problem.
It kind of highlights, though, that somebody off that panel has not got the slightest concept of what it is to question your own identity. And they're passing judgment on people that are. So how can they be suitable for that panel? And that's really what this comes down to, that they take on an expert status, that they can flannel language, they can twist whatever's said to suit their own, what they feel, and try and look at it from their perspective, when actually it's got to be the person in front of you. You've got to see this from somebody else's perspective. And if you're unable to do that, you're not really suitable for the job.
Exactly. And like, I would ask the question is, why is there no trans involvement in that panel? I mean, in any other sphere of life, say, for instance, if this was an issue to do with women, if there was no women on that panel, there would be uproar.
Yeah.
Because surely women are going to have an understanding of what those issues are going to be. The world has moved on so dramatically in recent years, and this concept of self-identity, is finding more traction, more and more places. I think we were fourth, at the time, and yet there's, I think now 8, as far as I remember, countries where you can self-identify in some shape or form, some in good ways and some in bad, but there's still, the concept is there, and the understanding that the concept should be available.
It's almost like every country allows self-identification, but unless you're trans in that country. So like you said,
of course.
I'm allowed to self-identify as a woman.
Yeah,
I never challenged it. I was told I was a girl, and then I grew up into a woman, and I never challenged it because I didn't need to. So I was allowed to self-identify with the label that they gave me when I was born.
You've put it in much better terms than I did.
No, thank you for teaching me much more about it. I'm actually interested in that because I'm a scientist by nature, and when we did science exams at school, if anyone ever said, if there was like a multiple choice question and answer, and if it was ever always or never, you'd be very, very careful about that question, because nothing is ever always and nothing is never, never. And it makes me think of the spectrum of gender. And is anybody ever 0% or 100%? And then it makes me think, okay, so where on that balance is the tipping point? If you're that far down on the spectrum, you just accept the gender that they gave you at birth. And then somewhere along the line, you go, absolutely not. I'm not, that is just not my gender. And I'm just wondering, where's the fulcrum? Where's the tipping point? Because there will be people teetering. Do you know what I mean? Kind of half accepting, oh, it's all right, I can live like this, but actually, should I really be living this way? And would that be more comfortable for me? So it's fascinating. I love.
Yeah, and when you get into conversations with people who identify as gender fluid, that is exactly where the issue comes. It's around that moment of, well, I don't really want to accept the gender that I've been given, but I really kind of don't want to be somewhere in the middle, nor do I want to kind of go to another gender. And it's this difficulty about, well, I'm on the tipping point, about, and therefore today I might want to identify with the gender that has been given to me, or tomorrow I want to give, to be a little bit more fluid or maybe non-binary, or the day after I might want to identify as the opposite gender. And it's an interesting area, because I think that conversation is happening more and more now, and more non-binary people are coming out, and I think those conversations are going to change the narrative over the next couple of years, because I think the more people who come out as non-binary specifically, or gender fluid, I think it's going to change an understanding of that spectrum, an understanding of these hard facts of just male and female. And because again, I think that also focused this idea of identification, that we have to fit into a specific type of box, and that goes to all the problems that causes, where, we talk about, trans women in women's spaces, or, trans men being in danger, all these problems that we have actually all focus on having this binary box of male and female and going from one to the other. So I think part of that will start to slowly but surely, forgive me for this statement, maybe not in the UK, but around the rest of the world, I think it will start to slowly break down. And we see it an awful lot more in European countries and South American countries, where that understanding of gender is actually changing, that there is a spectrum rather than this just binary gender.
I think the saddest thing I'm hearing today, if I'm honest with you, is that Ireland had a clean slate when it started becoming progressive. And unfortunately, it looked to the UK for models of care. If only they'd look the other way across the Atlantic, there are some far better models of care in operation, very successful, great outcomes, if that's what we want to term it. And unfortunately, Ireland turned towards the UK. And I think what I mean by that is that I agree entirely about the spectrum. The one thing, therapy room, when they come in, they have a fixed idea of what trans means, but actually it's an exploration of gender, and it's about working out who you are and what you like. I read your story earlier. I got a link, and it said some of the stuff that you did when you were younger. One of them was play football. I played football. I like football, but when I moved into the trans community, that there was this narrative that genuine trans people don't like sport, and genuine trans people don't do this. And I think we're breaking out. I think the young people are breaking out of that. And I love it when I see a young trans guy, for example, wearing nail polish and eyeliner. That's who they are. And the fact that they identify as male does not negate their right to express their personality, character in whatever way they like. And that's what I'm hoping we're moving to. And that's why I have such a keen interest in the young people.
Oh, they are definitely the future. But you're right. I mean, I'll be truthful, I still play football. even at my age, I'm aching here after training last night. I'm looking forward to playing in the European Gay Games in August. I play 5-a-side, 7-a-side football with a gang of girls. I think I'm the only trans person. I don't know, but I wouldn't question that either in the group. But yeah, you're right. I think I've got a lot of hope. We've got, and I know here we've got a gang of young kind of 20-year-olds starting an organisation called Transport over here, and they're looking at different types of sports at the moment. It's literally only started in January, and they're looking to try and provide situations where trans people would like to get into sport, especially things like swimming and, where it's difficult sometimes because you fear the spaces, you fear, being in that vulnerable position in a swimsuit, and a lot of people have always had that fear, or it's a big moment for a lot of people when they get into the swimming pool, for instance, for the first time, having transitioned or having socially transitioned. And I think kids don't see things the same way as we may have done back in the day. I think they see much more opportunities, and I think they demand more opportunities. I think they demand they have a belief in themselves that they should be able to do all these things, that they shouldn't matter whether they are a trans guy or a guy and they wear nail polish, or whether they're a trans woman and they play football. I think these things, they don't see those problems. And I think they only find those problems when somebody else has the problem for them, or they struggle with, say, a gym who is not allowing them the place where they need to change, or, they have a women's football team that are not accepting them, these sort of places. But they're in the minority, to be honest with you, over here at the moment. And hopefully that will remain the same.
I think if I understood correctly there, something just switched in my mind there. I think we've moved, when we spoke about the 80s and the 90s and how it was, years ago, the fight really was for acceptance. And now the fight's for equality. And I think there's a subtle difference there, that people accept we're around, and that, I can walk into Marks and Spencer's and pick up clothes and go and try them on, and people accept that I'll do that. But actually, equality goes beyond that. And it's actually that we want a full life. We want to be able to go and experience life like everybody else can. And I think that's where the young people are driving it, that they're not happy with acceptance, that now they're striving for equality.
Yeah, I think even acceptance, I think I might kind of step back. I think it's tolerate is probably
we
were okay with, they're over there, we know they're there and that's it. I think, but you're right. I think it's not even, it's not acceptance or toleration young people are looking for anymore. And I think what they want is the full right to be able to live. In our mission statement, we talk about being able to participate fully in all aspects of Irish society. I think that's exactly what kids want today. And they about whether or not this is something safe they can do, or somebody will be okay with them doing this, or, will everybody be all right with them coming out in school or whatever. I think these things should just be automatic. It should be just part of life. And I think that's, in lots of ways, that's what's happening. It's a great thing that they don't actually know or understand the previous struggle to get to where we are. So they don't see a problem in pushing these boundaries. They don't see a problem in pushing their demands, and they kind of look and say, oh, well, you did nothing in the past, sort of thing. But to have actually got to where we are, is they push and push and push. And it's great, because that's what we need. We need to be, vocal. We need to be visible. But we also need to be positively visible. Now, you continually use those words. It's about, actually, I remember watching a documentary on BBC Two in the early 80s about surgery. And it was that kind of voyeuristic kind of, the camera following the trans woman around and looking at everybody else's reactions to it. And that narrative didn't change for an awful long time. And I think nowadays, those sort of documentaries should be about the wonderful things that we do, the wonderful achievements that we get up to, because we have some wonderful members of our community throughout the world that do make huge achievements and do create change in lots of other ways, not just in trans areas. And I think that's what we should be highlighting, rather than, those negative stories that people try to put out there. And I think there is a hopeful future, but there's still a huge battle to happen before we can get it all right.
It reminds me, and I've told our listeners this lots of times, we went to, Abby and Marianne and I went to America last year to meet Joanna and Aidan Olsen-Kennedy and Darlene Tando. And after the conference, we went out for a bite to eat in this restaurant. And Darlene went off to the toilet. And she came straight out, and Joanna, she's like, uh-oh, triggered. And Darlene went straight up to the bar area and spoke to the manager and said, "You've got cubicle toilets, and you've gendered them. That it's not like you go in and then you have single cubicles closed off, and you've got girl and boy on them." And she was just not having it, and she had a big row with. So Darlene was, she was really vocal about it, and she wouldn't let it go. She wanted to force change in that cafe. I don't know whether they did or not, but and I often, when I go to a cafe or to a restaurant or what have you, and I see gendered toilets, I haven't yet challenged it. But I thought to myself the other day, I've started to challenge plastic straws. If they bring me my Diet Coke or my gin and tonic with a plastic straw, I say, no, thank you, I don't want a plastic straw, even if they've already put it in, just to make the point that we don't. Plastic straws aren't acceptable to be just used like that. And I haven't yet been brave enough to do that bathroom challenge. And maybe the time will come when I do. But I think, as well as we've got the youth of today coming through going, no, we're not accepting that. And if I'm going to go into the ladies' changing rooms and Marks and Spencer's, that is exactly where I'm going to go. And I'm going to try on whatever clothes I want to try on, and they won't accept it. And I think, cis people like me, we also need to kind of help equality, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about acceptance, tolerance, equality, and we've all got a part to play in that. Cis white female people like me wouldn't accept colour segregation anymore. Or sexuality segregation. We wouldn't accept it, and it's no longer acceptable for us to accept gender segregation if it's hurting somebody. And we've all got a part to play in that, I think.
Really vocal support, especially from young women within the feminist community specifically. I'm not sure if you're aware, back in the early part of 2018, when we were going through our Repeal the Eighth campaign, which was around abortion, the Let's Talk kind of group from the UK tried to come over here and have a talk under the guise of the constitutional conversation. But yet we were quite well aware that the conversation was actually going to be about trans women. However, eventually, the number eventually came to somewhere under 4,000, which is quite a large number for here, wrote a letter saying, actually, you're not welcome here. Trans women have been very much part of not only the feminist community, but also the lesbian community here for the last 40 years, and will continue to be so, and we're not going to let you come in here stirring up trouble and stirring up causing problems for us. And that message has continued in the last 2 years, when, you'll see quite a very vocal young feminist community online really attacking some of those negative, stories, and attacking some of those negative views that are coming from people that are trying to stir up that narrative in the UK. And even when somebody here steps up and sticks their head above the parapet, there's usually 20 young, very vocal feminists kind of there to defend you. And we've seen that this weekend, for instance. We've had some very difficult negativity on Twitter around a project which 2 young trans women had been running as part of a female festival here called Her Story. And some people picked up on it on Twitter, and there was some really negative comments about one of the participants. And all of a sudden, huge swathes of support came in on Twitter, specifically from here, in her defense and in the rest of our defense on this project, because it was very much about, why are these 10 trans women being included in what is a female story in a female festival? We can't even have our own festival, sort of thing. So, but yet the community stood up and said no. And it wasn't the trans community, it was the feminist community, it was the lesbian community. They were the people who were stepping up and kind of going, no, we're not going to put up with this. The reason they're part of that is because they're part of Irish society. They're part of, they are women within this community and in society here, and that's why we will defend them. And that's very empowering, I have to say. It's
in numbers, isn't it? It reminds me of the school bully who gets away with it until some kids are brave enough to go, don't do that, kind. And then the other kids come along and go, yeah, I don't think that's kind either. And if there's enough of them, the school bully will go, all right, then can find something else to do. So that's a really warming story. It's not something I see very often over here. I don't know about you, Marianne. Do we see that?
I kind of just wanted to, I always have to make this point that when I go out onto the street, for want of a better description, what we see in the newspapers and what we read on Twitter and Facebook, the overwhelming majority of people in the UK really just don't care one way or the other. Maybe ignorance allows some of this narrative to creep in a little bit, but people really don't really care that much, and we're allowed to go about our business. And I do think social media and the printed press, which is diminishing slowly, are painting a narrative that isn't actually quite what the reality is, but it does keep the politicians at bay. It does stop the Equality Act going through. I spoke to my MP last year and I just said, I just wish they'd put it through and then we could end this debate. It'll probably bring up another debate, but, dare I say, it's like Brexit. It just rolls on and on and on, and it people just tire of it eventually. So, yeah, I think it would be wrong to say that people in the UK are intolerant, all on social media, trying to keep putting their views forward, but generally on the street we don't feel it. I get the sense that Ireland can. I mean, I do work with one or two people in Ireland, and they probably get more issues than I do on the street, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would have tended to agree though with your own situation. For the best part, most people over here are exactly the same. They don't really care. They are respectful. They're okay with trans people. They're obviously aware that we exist. I think the difficulty on the streets, I think, are twofold. One, I think it tends to be a particular cohort of people that are going to give you that problem on the street. I think two, then obviously depending on how visible you are on the street, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
I think then, there is a certain cohort of people will give you some grief, but I don't think it's prevalent in any great numbers. I don't think it's anything that's really a serious problem as such. And we've spoken to the police about this. They get very little issues with it. We run a program here called STOD, which is Stop Transphobia and Discrimination, which people report their issues from everything from, mild name calling to serious violence through the process. And again, while you do still get some incidents every week, it's very mild. And I agree with you that the kind of social media is a bubble. I've been trying to tell people this. It's a very much a bubble. Yes, there's a good number of people watching it, but it's not wider population. It's not this, like 63% of the population over here is on some sort of social media. But that doesn't mean they're all watching your story, or your conversation or that negativity. In fact, very few percentage of the wider population is going to be watching that.
Sarah, I think, you've taught me lots. There's so much to learn, and I hope you don't mind me saying I find it fascinating. And we've all got so much to learn. And clearly, someone like you who's been working 26 years as an advocate, and clearly you've contributed greatly to that acceptance and tolerance and equality that we are that we all should be striving for. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. And you have certainly taught me lots, which I always love. And my mind will be mulling it all over throughout the next few days. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been really, really, really interesting.
It's been a pleasure to meet you eventually. I've heard so much about you too. So
yeah, I'm sure.
And always good things.
Oh, that's nice. Anyway, lovely to talk to you. And I hope our listeners have learned as much as I have today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. We hope you've enjoyed our programme. Do go ahead and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you or anyone else are affected by any of the topics discussed in our podcast and you'd like to contact us, please drop us a line at doctor@gendergp.co.uk. We're very happy to accept ideas for future episodes and guests, or if there's something specific you'd like us to cover. You can also visit our website, www.gendergp.co.uk. You can follow us on social media @GenderGP, and you can sign up to our monthly newsletter. Full details can be found in the show notes on our podcast page. Thanks for listening.